Avoidance only comes back for these three reasons. When avoidant partners return after a breakup or period of distance, their motivations are rarely about genuine emotional growth or readiness for deeper intimacy. Understanding their true reasons for coming back helps you recognize whether their return represents real change or simply their attempt to meet their own unmet needs while maintaining their emotional distance. Reason 1. They can't handle the silence and self-reflection. As time passes after losing you, avoidants encounter something they've spent their lives avoiding: genuine solitude with their own thoughts and feelings, without your emotional presence serving as a distraction. They're forced to confront the emptiness they've been running from. This uncomfortable silence becomes unbearable because it requires the kind of self-reflection they desperately want to avoid. Avoidants are masters at using relationships and external stimulation to avoid dealing with their internal emotional landscape. When you were present, your emotional energy, conversations, and attention provided constant distraction from their own unresolved feelings. Your absence creates a psychological vacuum that forces them to face themselves, and this experience feels threatening and overwhelming. Rather than using this solitude for genuine emotional growth and self-examination, they seek to escape it by returning to you. They realize what they lost, not because they've developed greater emotional awareness, but because they can no longer avoid confronting their own emotional emptiness. Their return is motivated by discomfort, avoidance, rather than genuine appreciation for your value. This motivation explains why their returns often feel desperate or urgent. They're not coming back because they've learned to love better. They're coming back because being alone with themselves has become intolerable. They need your presence to resume their pattern of emotional avoidance, using your energy to distract from the inner work they're unwilling to do. The tragedy is that this represents a missed opportunity for genuine growth. The discomfort they feel in solitude is actually their psyche trying to process unresolved emotions and attachment wounds. Instead of embracing this discomfort as a pathway to healing, they seek to escape it through reconnection with you. This pattern keeps them stuck in cycles of avoidance rather than developing authentic emotional capacity. Their return based on this motivation is particularly frustrating because it feels like recognition of your worth when it's actually recognition of their own emotional limitations. They're not coming back because they've learned to appreciate you. They're coming back because they can't tolerate being alone with themselves. This distinction is crucial for understanding whether their return represents genuine change or simply desperation to avoid self-confrontation. The silence they can't handle isn't just external quiet. It's the internal silence that occurs when they stop running from their own emotions. Without your emotional energy to focus on, manage, or react to, they're left with their own unprocessed feelings and unhealed wounds. This internal confrontation feels unbearable, driving them back to you as an escape route rather than a genuine desire for partnership. Reason 2. Physical desire and sexual chemistry. The second primary reason avoidants return has nothing to do with emotional connection and everything to do with physical attraction and sexual desire. They may have convinced themselves they're over you emotionally, but your physical appeal and the sexual chemistry you shared continue to haunt them. This purely physical craving drives them back, often disguised as romantic feelings or relationship desire. Avoidants often compartmentalize their feelings, separating physical attraction from emotional connection in ways that allow them to pursue sexual satisfaction without acknowledging deeper emotional needs. They may genuinely believe they can return for physical intimacy without becoming emotionally involved again, not recognizing how their sexual desire often masks their emotional attachment. Your looks, your body, the way you move, and the physical chemistry you shared become increasingly magnetic as time passes. They find themselves fantasizing about physical intimacy with you, comparing other potential partners to you, and feeling dissatisfied with sexual experiences that lack the specific chemistry you provided. This physical longing intensifies over time rather than diminishing. The sexual connection you shared may have been one of the few areas where they felt truly present and engaged. For many avoidants, physical intimacy represents a safe form of connection that doesn't require the emotional vulnerability they fear. Sexual desire feels manageable and controllable in ways that emotional intimacy doesn't, making it easier for them to acknowledge and pursue. Their return based on physical attraction often presents as romantic interest, but careful observation reveals the focus on sexual reconnection rather than emotional rebuilding. They may emphasize physical compliments, sexual memories, and physical touch while avoiding deeper emotional conversations or relationship discussions. Their attention centers on recreating sexual chemistry rather than addressing relationship issues. This motivation is particularly problematic because it creates the illusion of romantic interest while actually representing a narrow focus on physical satisfaction. They may genuinely miss your body, your sexual chemistry, and the physical pleasure you provided, but this missing has nothing to do with missing you as a complete person or desiring genuine partnership. The intensity of their physical desire can be confusing because it feels like passionate love. However, their inability to extend this intensity into emotional realms reveals the limitations of their attraction. They want your body and the sexual connection you provided, but they remain unable or unwilling to engage with your emotional needs or create genuine intimacy. Reason 3. You are their emotional regulator and source of calm. Perhaps the most significant reason avoidants return is because you served as their emotional regulator, the person who helped them feel calm, secure, and emotionally stable without requiring reciprocal emotional labor from them. You provided a unique form of emotional comfort that they struggle to find elsewhere, making your absence particularly disruptive to their psychological equilibrium. Avoidants often struggle with emotional self-regulation despite their appearance of emotional independence. They rely heavily on external sources to manage their internal emotional states, and you likely serve this function without realizing it. Your presence, energy, and emotional availability help them feel grounded and secure in ways they couldn't achieve on their own. This regulatory function you provided was likely subtle and unacknowledged during your relationship. You may have offered comfort during their stress, provided stability during their emotional fluctuations, or simply created a calming presence that helped them feel more emotionally balanced. They became dependent on this regulatory support while maintaining the illusion of emotional independence. Without your emotional regulation, they experience increased anxiety, emotional instability, and a general sense of unease that they struggle to manage independently. Other people may not provide the same calming effect, or they may require emotional reciprocity that feels demanding and overwhelming. You offered emotional support without requiring equal emotional investment, making you irreplaceable in their emotional ecosystem. Their return based on this need is particularly manipulative because it positions you as an emotional service provider rather than an equal partner. They're not returning because they're ready to reciprocate your emotional investment. They're returning because they need the emotional stability you provided. This creates a fundamentally unequal dynamic where your role is to regulate their emotions while receiving minimal emotional support in return. The comfort and security they felt around you was likely one of the few times they experienced emotional peace without having to work for it. Your unconditional emotional availability allowed them to relax their hypervigilance and emotional defenses, creating a sense of safety they struggle to find elsewhere. This safety becomes addictive, drawing them back when other environments feel emotionally threatening or demanding. They may not consciously understand why they feel so drawn to return to you, experiencing it as a vague sense that something is missing or that life felt better when you were present. This unconscious recognition of your regulatory function drives their return even when they can't articulate why they need you back in their life. The manipulation behind these returns. Understanding these three motivations reveals the manipulative nature of most avoidant returns. None of these reasons indicate genuine emotional growth, readiness for reciprocal partnership, or ability to meet your emotional needs. Instead, they represent sophisticated attempts to use you to meet their own needs while maintaining their emotional distance and avoiding the inner work necessary for genuine relationship capacity. These returns often feel convincing because avoidants may display temporarily increased emotional availability or make promises about being different this time. However, their underlying motivations haven't changed. They still want the benefits you provided without having to reciprocate emotionally or do the personal growth work necessary for a healthy partnership. The timing of their returns often reveals their true motivations. They typically return when their discomfort with solitude becomes unbearable, when their sexual satisfaction elsewhere proves inadequate, or when they realize no one else provides the emotional regulation you offered. Their return is reactive to their own discomfort rather than proactive about creating better relationship dynamics. Why these returns fail? Returns based on these motivations inevitably fail because they don't address the fundamental issues that caused the original relationship problems. Avoidants returning to escape self-reflection will eventually need to face themselves again, often becoming restless and distant once they've temporarily satisfied their need for distraction. Those returning primarily for physical reasons will lose interest once the sexual novelty wears off, or they realize that sexual chemistry alone cannot sustain a relationship. The emotional demands of partnership will eventually resurface, triggering their avoidant patterns and leading to renewed distance and withdrawal. Even returns based on needing emotional regulation eventually fail because this dynamic creates resentment and imbalance. You'll eventually recognize that you're providing emotional labor without receiving reciprocal support, leading to frustration and eventual withdrawal of your regulatory services. Protecting yourself from these returns. Recognizing these motivations helps you evaluate whether an avoidance return represents genuine change or simply their attempt to use you to meet their own needs. Ask yourself whether they've demonstrated actual emotional growth, taken responsibility for their previous patterns, and shown readiness to reciprocate emotional investment. Look for evidence of self-reflection and personal growth work rather than accepting promises about being different. Genuine change requires sustained effort over time, not sudden revelations triggered by discomfort with their current situation. Be particularly wary of returns that focus heavily on physical chemistry or emphasize how much they've missed your calming presence. Most importantly, remember that you deserve a partner who chooses you for your complete self, not someone who returns because they can't handle solitude, miss your body, or need your emotional regulation services. Their return should be about wanting to create genuine partnership with you, not about using you to avoid their own emotional work or meet their specific needs, while offering minimal emotional reciprocity in return. The cycle of temporary satisfaction. When avoidants return for these three reasons, they often experience temporary satisfaction that reinforces their belief that returning was the right choice. The immediate relief from solitude, the renewed physical connection, and the restoration of emotional regulation create a honeymoon period that can last weeks or even months. During this time, they may genuinely believe they've changed, or that the relationship will be different this time. However, this temporary satisfaction is built on the same foundation that caused the original problems. They're still using you to avoid self-reflection, still prioritizing physical chemistry over emotional connection, and still depending on you for emotional regulation without reciprocating. The underlying patterns remain unchanged, meaning the same issues will inevitably resurface once the novelty of reunion wears off. The cycle becomes particularly painful because each return creates hope that this time will be different, While each inevitable withdrawal reinforces the pattern of intermittent reinforcement that keeps you emotionally attached, they learn that they can leave when emotional demands become too intense and return when their own discomfort becomes unbearable, creating a dynamic that serves their needs while destabilizing your emotional well-being. The false promise of change. Avoidants returning for these reasons often present their return as evidence of personal growth or changed perspective. They may claim they've realized what they lost, that they understand your value better now, or that they're ready to commit more fully to the relationship. These declarations feel convincing because they address your previous concerns and seem to indicate the emotional awareness you've been hoping for. However, their supposed realizations are typically reactive rather than reflective. They haven't gained deeper insight into their attachment patterns or developed greater emotional capacity. They've simply experienced discomfort that motivated them to seek familiar comfort and distraction. Their understanding of what they lost is limited to recognizing their own discomfort without necessarily appreciating your actual worth or developing the capacity to meet your needs. This false promise of change is particularly manipulative because it exploits your hope and investment in the relationship. They present their return as the breakthrough you've been waiting for, the moment when their emotional walls finally come down. In reality, they're simply temporarily more motivated to maintain connection, because their current discomfort outweighs their fear of intimacy. The promises they make during returns often focus on external changes rather than internal growth. They might promise to communicate more, spend more time together, or be more physically affectionate. However, these behavioral promises don't address their fundamental emotional limitations or their inability to engage in reciprocal emotional partnership. The emotional cost to you. Accepting returns based on these motivations creates significant emotional costs that accumulate over time. Each cycle of reunion and separation reinforces trauma bonding patterns that make it increasingly difficult to maintain clarity about your own needs and boundaries. You become conditioned to accept minimal emotional investment as evidence of love and to prioritize their comfort over your own emotional well-being. The hope that each return generates becomes emotionally exhausting over time. You invest emotional energy in believing that this time will be different, adapting your expectations to their limitations, and working to maintain connection with someone who fundamentally cannot reciprocate your emotional investment. This cycle gradually erodes your self-worth and your ability to recognize healthy relationship dynamics. Their returns also prevent you from healing and moving forward. Each time you begin to process the relationship and develop emotional distance, their return reactivates your attachment and prevents the closure necessary for emotional growth. You remain stuck in patterns of hope and disappointment, rather than learning to choose partners who can meet your emotional needs consistently. The emotional labor required to maintain these cyclical relationships becomes increasingly unsustainable. You're constantly managing their comfort level with intimacy, accommodating their need for emotional regulation, and providing physical and emotional availability without receiving reciprocal investment. This imbalance creates resentment and emotional depletion that affects your overall well-being. Red flags during their return. Recognizing the warning signs during an avoidance return can help you distinguish between genuine change and motivated self-interest. Pay attention to whether they take genuine responsibility for their previous patterns or simply acknowledge that you were hurt. Taking responsibility requires understanding how their behavior affected you and demonstrating specific changes in their emotional capacity. Notice whether their return focuses primarily on what they've missed about you rather than what they're ready to offer you. If their expressions center on their own discomfort, their physical desire for you, or how much better they felt when you were regulating their emotions, these indicate self-serving motivations rather than genuine relationship investment. Observe whether they're willing to engage in difficult conversations about relationship patterns and emotional needs. Genuine change requires honest examination of previous dynamics and commitment to addressing the issues that cause problems. If they deflect these conversations or become defensive when you express concerns, their return is likely motivated by need rather than growth. Watch for signs that they're trying to quickly restore physical and emotional intimacy without doing the relationship work necessary to address previous problems. This rush to normalize connection suggests they're seeking comfort and satisfaction rather than building healthier relationship foundations. Setting boundaries during returns. If you choose to consider their return, establishing clear boundaries protects your emotional well-being while testing their genuine commitment to change. Require evidence of sustained personal growth work, such as therapy, self-help efforts, or concrete steps they've taken to address their attachment patterns. Genuine change requires sustained effort over time, not sudden insights triggered by discomfort. Insist on taking relationship rebuilding slowly rather than immediately returning to previous intimacy levels. This pace allows you to observe whether their changed behavior is sustainable or simply motivated by their current needs. It also protects you from becoming immediately re-entangled in patterns that serve their emotional regulation needs. Maintain your own emotional independence and support systems rather than immediately resuming your role as their primary emotional regulator. Continue pursuing your own interests, maintaining other relationships, and focusing on your own emotional growth. This independence helps you evaluate their return objectively rather than through the lens of emotional attachment. Communicate your needs clearly and observe their response over time. Genuine change will be evidenced by sustained effort to meet your emotional needs rather than temporary accommodation, followed by gradual return to previous patterns. Their willingness to consistently prioritize your emotional well-being alongside their own indicates authentic relationship commitment. The power of saying no. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for both yourself and an avoidant partner is to refuse their return. Accepting their return based on these three motivations often enables their avoidant patterns and prevents them from facing the discomfort necessary for genuine growth. Your refusal forces them to find other ways to manage their emotional needs, potentially motivating actual personal development. Saying no also protects your own emotional health and creates space for relationships that can meet your needs consistently. Each time you accept an avoidance return based on their needs rather than their capacity to reciprocate, you're choosing familiar dysfunction over the possibility of healthy partnership with someone else. Your refusal sends a clear message about your worth and standards. It communicates that you value yourself enough to require reciprocal emotional investment and that you won't accept relationships that primarily serve the other person's needs while leaving yours unmet. This boundary setting often motivates more genuine effort from avoidants who realize they cannot simply return whenever their discomfort becomes unbearable. Understanding these three motivations empowers you to make informed decisions about whether to accept their return based on their actual capacity for change rather than their temporary expressions of need or desire. You deserve someone who returns because they're ready to love you fully, not someone who returns because they need what you provide while remaining unable to provide what you need in return. Recognizing these patterns helps you choose relationships that honor your emotional needs rather than simply accommodating someone else's emotional limitations.